Well, good morning, APUSHers. This is the second of two online lectures about topic 814, Society and Transition. In the first video, we took a look at the trend of declining public confidence and trust in the federal government. And here we're going to take a look at a few examples of how that lack of trust and that lack of confidence is going to lead over a variety of political and social clashes throughout the 1970s. Here we go. It's safe to say here that every one of the topics that we come up for these 1970s clashes has some sort of a reflection on modern politics here in the 21st century. So there'll be kind of a steady dose of that as we go through these. In the 1970s and really in modern politics and throughout almost all political periods, there have been some questions over what the power of the federal government should be, and how much is too much power in order to balance the need to protect individual rights without having that potential abuse of power. Thanks to issues surrounding the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal, there have been a lot of questions in the early 70s about abuse of federal power and trying to keep things, the desire to keep things a bit more open and public and making sure the federal government is going to protect the needs of the people at large. I don't think we need to go into too much detail on this, but I think it is fair to say that here in the 1970s, this is kind of a low point on the trust in the federal government and the exercise of federal powers, really going back decades and decades on this. A second issue that starts to come up here in the 1970s, because the carryover from 1950s and 60s has got to do with the issue of race and the various movements for a greater protection of individual rights. When it comes down to the civil rights movement and the concept of affirmative action, in the 1950s and 60s, between Supreme Court cases and desegregation movements, both in education and in the workplace, there's been a lot of question about affirmative action. Affirmative action is, if you remember this, affirmative action is the idea that there have to be positive steps taken in order to correct injustices and inequalities of the past. And by the time you get to the 1970s, most colleges, majority of colleges, have started to put into place some type of a racial quota system to make sure that they are admitting a certain number of African American and other minority students as a way to make sure that their admissions, the students that are admitted, are more reflective of the general population at large. Well, in 1978, a case dealing with this gets to the Supreme Court. Alan Backey is a medical student. He is a white medical student in California. Well, he's a prospective medical student because he has applied to go to medical school at the University of California, and his application has been rejected a couple of times, despite the fact that he has higher test scores than other applicants that were admitted. The issue that he sees that is the factor here is that he is white, and some of these other students that have been admitted in are minority African American students, and so he says this is blatantly a violation of his civil rights because he's been discriminated against on the basis of race. And when the Supreme Court rules in on this in 1978, this is a fairly complicated decision from the court. They rule that Backey should be admitted because the racial quota system that the University of California had in place was too rigid and too strict in order to make fair and equitable admission decisions without there being a violation of his civil rights based on race. But in general, the Supreme Court ruled that affirmative action and race could still be a factor on these admissions decisions. So what you see is sort of a question mark being raised by the court so far as the future of affirmative action. And this question mark means that, again in the 1990s and again in the early 2000s and again here currently in the 2020s, there are, here in January, well, as of January of 2023, the Supreme Court's got a couple of cases pending that they are going to rule again on this specific issue. And there seems to be some question as to whether or not affirmative action is still going to be in place the way that we will talk about it here in the 1970s. But this is, again, a 1970s issue that has a modern, current events political situation for us. In the category of women's rights, we saw in the 1960s the creation of the National Organization for Women, and a real assertion for women's rights, not just in the political sense, but in social and economic equality, including the you know, uh, well, desire to pass an equal rights amendment. This came up in the 1920s, but here in the 1960s and early 70s, there's a real conversation out there. Should there be an amendment to the Constitution that is put in place? That amendment effort is going to fail thanks in no small part to organizations like Stop ERA, which is an organization led by Phyllis Schlafly that is arguing that that there shouldn't be this level of total equality in place. Her argument is, kind of like emblematic for the times, that she says that if you take away any kind of distinction from gender within the U.S. Constitution, then women could be drafted, that there could be other unforeseen social ramifications that come into being. And even though the Equal Rights Amendment did pass through Congress, it failed to get the needed 38 states to ratify for this to take effect. And so there's a level of like a slowdown, so to speak, on the push towards mandating and making it constitutional so far as the requirements for equal rights between genders. I think there is more of a reliance that this is just something that is going to be taken care of through society at large. In the early 1970s, Title IX to the Education Act is put into place. This happens actually under the Nixon administration. The photo here is from 2022. This is on the 50th anniversary of Title IX, because this makes it a federal requirement that for federal funding for education, that there has to be equal funding put in place for men's and women's programs, athletic programs. And this is something that in the 1970s and 80s is kind of seen as being like very slow in getting anything done. But now that we are 50 years into this, there is greater attention placed on women's sports, both collegiate and as a result of this for some professional sports in 21st century society. Whether you're talking about the women's national soccer team, or as I am recording this, there was some headlines about the women's college basketball tournament, getting all-time highs so far as the ratings are concerned, getting a little bit more newsworthy attention. So definitely progress in this direction. In 1973, so still here in the 1970s, the Supreme Court rules in the case of Roe v. Wade in the context of women's health and women's reproductive issues, that states are not allowed to ban abortions within the first trimester of pregnancy. And from the time that this was put in place, the argument from the pro-abortion advocates was that this was a matter of health care for women and trying to make sure you were taking care of women's reproductive rights. And ever since then, organizations, Operation Rescue in the 1980s, the Christian Coalition that we'll be talking about towards the end of this topic, they start to be openly critical about this, and raise the questions about morality of abortions in general, and are there actually like criminal behaviors that are associated with this. I hope that most of y'all are aware that this has become a contentious topic over the last 50 years or so. And as of the summer of 2022, the Supreme Court has ruled in the case of Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization that the bulk of the Roe decision is overturned, that things are kind of given back to the states in terms of determining their own abortion laws and abortion regulations, so removing that from the federal viewpoint whatsoever. So here in this, there's a kind of a mix between what the power of the federal government's going to be, but it's also getting into issues specifically into race and issues specifically into women's rights as well. Taking a look at this on a little bit of a broader scale, there are clashes in the 1970s over some general social and cultural issues as well. There are questions about family structures. Because while there is still a dominant image of nuclear families in the United States, remember, nuclear families are that traditional two-parent household, traditionally with, by this point, with the husband being the moneymaker and women being in charge of the cult of domesticity. That's seeing some challenges and some changes here in the 1970s, primarily because there are more women at work, which is going to lead to dual income households. It's also going to lead to women choosing to wait longer to get married and to have children. And so this is leading to some questions about, you know, just in the family structures in general, more children being born into single family households, either because women are waiting or choosing not to get married, or because the divorce rate seems to be a little bit higher in the 1970s than it was in previous decades. All of this kind of is a reflection of some of the changing social attitudes that are a carryover from the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement in the 1960s, as well as the counterculture movement, the growing informality that's in place, the reflection of greater diversity in pop culture, whether it's TV or movies or music in the 1970s. There's definitely a more diverse set of, more of a diverse representation in the popular media of the time. This leads to 1970s conservatives to kind of see like some real concerns and some real fears. They looked at the counterculture movement of the late 60s going into the 70s, and there were concerns about juvenile delinquency. That without doubt, there is a growth of recreational drug use in the 1970s, and so this is kind of leading conservatives to be concerned about the impact it's going to have on young Americans and the impact it's going to have specifically in urban centers, because the more impoverished nature in inner city neighborhoods and the higher rates of drug use in inner city neighborhoods, and combine that with Vietnam War protests and civil rights protests, there's just a real contentious atmosphere in major cities in the United States in the 1970s. And with all these other changes in family structures, conservatives are concerned about challenges to traditional family viewpoints. And so, as we'll see in this final slide coming up, that there is going to be a social movement that's going to kind of transition into politics as you get from the 1970s into the 1980s. Because in the late 70s, there is a growth in the number of church organizations for evangelical Christians. This is a College Board terms it as a rapid and substantial growth. So it's not like there was a lack of religion going on in the United States. This is happening more because there is a little bit more political and social activism by religious conservatives. Phyllis Schlafly and the Stop ERA being a good example of this, but in a very broad, much in a broader sense, when Nixon appeals to the silent majority of American voters in the early 70s, the 1972 election, this is a call to evangelical Christians and to other church organizations to become more politically active. So, two examples that we see of this in the 1970s. One is the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation is a political activist organization. It's like a think tank. The purpose of this organization is to basically generate policy positions to lobby towards the federal government, and it's doing this in a very, promoting a social conservatism, some of the same concerns and worries that we've seen in the previous slides, but also on economic conservatism, trying to figure out a way to reduce the scope of the federal government and to try to rejuvenate the failing economy in the 1970s. The Heritage Foundation is definitely around and still active today, and it still ranks as one of the most influential political organizations in the United States. By the end of the decade, the Moral Majority is founded by Jerry Falwell and other evangelical Christians. They are, in the Moral Majority, they are really focused on trying to return things to traditional family values in the United States, Christian values, and trying to, kind of push back against changes in liberal rights and social rights that have grown in the 1960s and 70s. And there's going to be a significant amount of success coming from these organizations, because as we get from the 1970s and move into the 1980s, they are going to help usher in the Reagan Revolution in the 1980s as a return to conservatism that is going to push us well into modern political discourse. But that is actually a topic for Unit 9 and a topic getting closer to some current events. So we will hit the brakes here. But through these two lectures on the 1970s, I hope you are able to see that the 70s are a transitional period. It does say society in transition. This transitional period is kind of trying to establish a new level of conversation between the liberal rights movements of the 1960s and trying to rejuvenate, as we see here, some of the more traditional conservative elements that have been around for, well, generations before that.